Welcome back. This is another really great session that I'm excited about. And while I tell you a little bit about our presenters, Rakaya is going to share her screen again. And this presentation, I'm super excited. You only need a spark of data to ignite change in your programs. So our presenters today are Rakaya Alavi. She is a senior evaluation consultant at PTG International. Passionate about data-driven decision-making, she advocates for the application of renowned techniques in working with data to drive positive change for every organization. She holds a master's degree in industrial organizational psychology from the University of Maryland, College Park, and is well-versed in the Kirkpatrick 4 levels of evaluation and Phillips ROI methodology. Denise Medeiros is vice president at PTG International. She joined PTG in 2014 and currently leads the training evaluation consultancy arm with clients including the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, International Revenue Service, Census Bureau, Transportation Security Administration, Veterans Administration, and Carasoft. Prior to PTG, she taught math, led a STEM program, provided training consultation to the U.S. Department of Energy's Health and Safety Services, developed training for Lockheed Martin, and provided training and software implementation for GE Aerospace. So with that, I want to remind everybody, you can connect with our presenters by either typing in the chat in FeedLoop or using the Q&A button on the blue bar under the presentation. Also, right at the top of the presentation window, there is 2 arrows in a black box, and that makes it full screen for you. So without further ado, Rakaya and Denise.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to PTG session for the TOC Annual Institute. My colleague Denise Medeiros and I will be walking you through understanding how you only need a spark of data to ignite change in your programs.
And everyone, really excited to be here.
For the folks that are participating in the gamification of this annual institute, the first code that PTG is offering is impact measured. All one word.
Now don't leave just to go put that game code in. Just tuck that away.
Next slide, please.
Well, we're really excited all of you can be with us today. And here's what we're going to be covering.
Yes, so a brief overview of what we'll be going over today. We will do a quick review of the basics when it comes to data collection. We will also go over an easy way to understand sample sizes and calculations, as well as effective approaches to analyzing quantitative and qualitative data on training effectiveness. We also have a fun activity plan that will allow you to apply what you're learning, and we're going to conclude with stories directly from our clients. So to jump right into it, we wanted to establish common terminology for this session by going back to the basics. What is qualitative and quantitative data? So quantitative data involves the numericizing of information that's collected. So yes, no responses, certain types of multiple choice responses, and Likert scale responses can all be numericized relatively easily. And this numericization dictates how the analysis of the information is carried out. Qualitative data, on the other hand, involves free responses to questions and provides respondents with the opportunity to express more in-depth opinions. So this information cannot be as easily numericized like the quantitative data can, but a statistical analysis can still be done on this information. We're going to show you a few examples of how this analysis is done on qualitative information as the session goes on. Okay. So I also wanted to touch on the various modes of data collection. In the training world, usually when people think about data collection, surveying is the first method that comes to mind. However, there are alternate methods to collect the necessary information. Focus groups and interviews are great ways to collect qualitative information. Observations and observation forms are an especially great way to understand how the training has behaviorally influenced the participants. Tests and pre-existing records are other forms of gathering what is usually quantitative information.
We at PTG have used all of these modes of data collection. So we're well versed with having that experience. A lot of times folks say, well, what is the difference between a survey and a questionnaire? And really, you know, surveys tend to be more anonymous, whereas questionnaires are frequently sent to a specific audience that's already known, and they may share their information with us so that we can reach back out to them and have follow-up questions to those questionnaires. So one of the things that we get asked a lot is, just tell me what the right sample size is. And the trick about sample size is that there isn't a standard size that you're supposed to use. It really is based on the population. So we wanted to help you understand a little bit more about sample size. And you want to make sure your sample size is representative of your population, which is why there isn't this universal metric. We can't just say, well, just as long as you ask 40 people, then you're good to go, right? Because if you're training 400,000 people, 40 people is really not helpful. But what I can tell you is that the larger the population is that you're trying to represent, the less of a percent of that population you need in order to have a good enough complement of information in order to glean what that population, what's really representative of that population. For you math geeks out there, it's an exponential function that plateaus. So here's some easy statistics to help you figure out what that actual sample size should be. So if you take your smartphone and you go to the calculator and you turn it sideways so that you're so that you can get the engineering calculator, then you'll be able to, oh, never mind. You don't have to do this. That's definitely not going to work, right? So that usually people see that formula and go, yeah, I don't want to do that. So let's show you that in today's world of technology, there are sample size calculators that you can use out on the internet for free that are really helpful. If you go to calculator.net, you can, and let me make sure, can you see my calculator? Or you're looking still at the screen, at my slide, right?
Fill out the slide, yeah.
So let me share my calculator here and show you that. Okay, so now you can see I'm on the calculator website, and you can find out the sample size that you need. And one of the things I wanted to point out is that it's actually set up with some standards that are very common when evaluating data, which is typically many organizations will use as a standard a 95% confidence level with a 5% margin of error. So those are already set up for you. And then all you need to say is, well, I know, for example, that I'm training 4,000 people, for example. And then you would just hit calculate and it would tell you that your sample size is 351. The interesting thing is, as I mentioned, if you only had 400 people that you were training, for example, that you wanted to survey, your sample size is 197. So you can see that it did not go up by 10, by a multiple of 10 when I went from 400 to 4,000. And if I said I was training 40,000 people, I would only need 381. And the reason for that is because really what you have to think about is how much does each individual response play in the outcome of the data. So each individual response here only has a 1/4% on average, 1/4% of influence over the numbers. And so that's why as you get higher in your population size, your sample size does not get significantly higher, because it really is only going to change your results by a small fraction. And it will still be within that 95% confidence level with the 5% margin of error. So that's really what we wanted to show you, is that there is an easy way to find out what the sample size is that you need. And I'm going to go back to sharing my slides. All right, so let's take a look at assessing the quantitative data. Now that we've figured out that we are getting enough responses for our sample size, when we receive the data, what do we do with it? Well, at PTG, we have an internal system that we use called TEMPO, stands for Training Evaluation for Measurement and Performance Optimization. And what that does is it allows us to collect data and also helps us with the analysis through our reporting functionality, which really provides us with the ability to aggregate the data, to visualize the data through charting, to filter the data by various types of information. So, and by any of the questions, for example, or by any of the metadata that we also collect. So, and by metadata, I mean that data that's behind the scenes of the survey collection process. You know, the course, the class, the time frame, all of that information that's collected along with the survey data. So I'm going to pass it back over to Rakaya so she can talk a little bit more about this.
Thanks, Denise. So as you can see in this snippet here, there's two different types of charts that Tempo provides. We have the simple bar charts that display the number of responses that were received per question. But we also have the stacked bar charts, which are usually ideal for Likert scale responses. You can see by the key at the bottom here that each color represents a different Likert scale response. So you can see that for the questions that are displayed here, there was a generally a positive response for these topics. I also want to point out the section averages. You can see at the bottom right hand of the snippet. These averages are used when there are separate sections that are present in the questionnaire. The idea is that if there is a section that has a lower average than the rest, then the training or course owners would have to look into that section or that area of the training program and make adjustments as needed, since they received a lower average than the rest of the sections.
And I'd also like to add to that, you know, frequently one of the things that we hear is, well, what does a 4.23 mean anyway? And we really agree that that's not as telling as looking at the distribution of the data, which is why we have the bar graphs that show how the data is distributed so that you can see what percentage of the respondents responded positively or negatively to your Likert scale question, because really that's a more specific story than just saying we got an average of a 4.23. What's really more telling is to say 83% of the respondents responded positively, that the technology allowed them to be effective in interacting with their instructor.
So we just covered the assessment of quantitative information. Now we're moving on to assessing qualitative data. So the first method that we wanted to present was a sentiment analysis, which allows us to determine the general attitude that's captured in the comments. So in this data sample, you can see that the phrases within the comments are coded in either green, which represents a positive response, or they're coded in red, which denotes a negative response or attitude. The closer that there's also ratings that are presented on the right-hand side. And the closer that a rating is to 1, a positive 1, indicates how positive the general attitude is within that comment. And on the flip side, the closer that it is to a negative 1 indicates a more negative attitude captured within the comment. So this snapshot also shows you that within this sample data set, the comments were generally depicting a positive attitude based on the high amounts of green, the visible amounts of green that's seen.
That's something that you can do yourself. If you're collecting smaller amounts of data, you can look through for those positive words, do searches for the positive words or the negative words. But just be careful, because just like things can have two meanings, right? If you don't see it in the context, right? So it may seem like it's a negative when really it's a positive. For example, the last comment says, I like the videos to go along with the training, no death by PowerPoint. So death by PowerPoint is a negative term, but in this case, it was a positive response because they were happy that there was no death by PowerPoint here. So you do have to be careful about those types of things. And that's one of the things that we're always working on tweaking and improving when we do our analysis, is looking for, are we categorizing those comments correctly? And so it's a learning about that, and you can have systems that will learn that, or you can go in and do sampling on your own and look for those comments, but be sure to make sure you're categorizing them correctly when you look at the context in which they're used. So now we want to talk a little bit about assessing the qualitative data in terms of thematic analysis. We're going to talk about what's the difference between inductive and deductive coding, and talk to you a little bit about the tag cloud report. So did I miss a slide? I guess not. Okay. So Rakai, do you want to talk a little bit about inductive versus deductive? Or is that in another slide?
That's in another slide. We'll cover that later.
Okay. So this is called a comment tag cloud. Many of you have seen comment tag clouds before, or word clouds, where we know that the larger the word, the more it shows up. And it's one way that you can kind of quickly gauge what was the information that you were getting in your qualitative analysis, in your qualitative data. So you could take all your qualitative data and put it in a word cloud and see which words pop up quickly, that pop up as the largest, and that may be telling. It also may pop up some generic words that are not as useful. And so what do you do then? In our case, we have a comment tag cloud that allows us to eliminate those common words. So if we say, oh, look, data showed up a lot of times, but that doesn't really tell me anything, we could actually eliminate the word data, and then it will make the other words more prominent that show up the next highest, so we can take a look at what those words are. And our comment tag cloud in our system, one of the things that it also allows us to do is see how that word was used in context. And that's one of the things that we really appreciate when we're doing our analysis, is that we can take a look at where were most of the comments focused on, what words were they most focused on, and how were they used in context. So that's one of the things that allows us to, we can hover over a word and actually see where it was used. But even if you don't have that functionality, having that word cloud does give you some insights into what types of comments you're receiving and what are the themes and topics that they tend to be centered around. Here we go. So inductive versus deductive coding. Let's, I'm going to pass it over to Rakaya to talk to you a little bit more about that.
Sure. So this should be categorized as back to the basics as well. Deductive coding generally refers to cultivating a theory and then finding specific evidence that backs your theory up. So as you can see in the little illustration here, the hypothesis is that Dr. Seuss hates cats, provides supporting examples. So you can see that in the picture, just the cat is creating a mess and just is not agreeing with Dr. Seuss. So that supports the hypothesis that he doesn't like cats. Inductive coding, on the other hand, involves a review of the data and generating an overall conclusion after that review is complete. So the illustration again here indicates a few characteristics of Dr. Seuss, which culminates in the hypothesis that Dr. Seuss just doesn't like cats.
I would not like my cat if it took my lollipop either. So why do we bring up inductive and deductive coding? Because this is, you can use both when you're doing your analysis, your data analysis. There's room for both inductive and deductive reasoning in the analysis of the data that you collect. And we talk about the data we've been collecting, and most people think about that reaction data, but we're also talking about the data that you collect when you are collecting data after folks have gone back to their jobs and how they're performing their jobs. And we're also talking about data that you haven't collected that's already available in your organization from other parts of the organization that are collecting data. Because you may find that the operational data is what's going to allow you to see how what participants have learned in training is being used and impacting the organizational goals. So we wanted to take an opportunity to have you try out an activity. And I wanted to see if Rakaya could share her screen with you to show you that activity. Can you do that, Rakaya?
Yes, I can.
We're going to take a look at some qualitative data to see how would you actually categorize this data. So one of the things that we do is look for themes in the data, and we have some common themes that we see through the data that we collect. And those common themes may be different regarding, depending on which agency or organization we're dealing with. And you can see that Rakaya is sharing with you a spreadsheet with some qualitative responses. These are actual qualitative responses that we've received in previous surveys. These were in response to a level 1 reaction survey to training. And so if you take a look at those qualitative responses, we thought it might be fun for you to take an opportunity to come up with what would be the theme that you would come up with for these responses, and which responses would go in under which theme category. So why don't you go ahead and chat with us in the chat and let us know what kinds of themes you see in these qualitative responses. I'm going to try to get into our chat here. Here we go.
Nice. So I'm seeing comments about the instructors and course content, which is absolutely correct.
Usefulness of information. Thanks, Jerry. Okay. Course length. So course length, Chris, would be a category. And then what we would do is we would categorize anything regarding course length, and we might break it up into too long, too short, or just right, right? So that's the other thing that we would do is we would have maybe course length as a theme and then have subtopics underneath that. Attributes of the training. Good one, Gary. And also the comments about the instructors. That's another one that we usually have a theme about instructors. And again, we look at, what were the comments about the instructors? And then what we do is group those together. And so what we found is that it's very helpful when you're reporting on the findings in your data that you provide percentages of comments that fell under certain categories. And then you can talk about what those categories had, what the comments in those categories had to say.
Just looking at this first comment here, I would go so far as adding a category for all valuable.
Yep. That's actually one of the very common things when people are really satisfied with the training overall and don't have anything specific to say. They'll say all good or all valuable or that was great. And that would just fall into the one positive response category, general category. So, and then you can see that good information would fall under course content because the information that they received in the course is part of the course content. And so that would really be something that, again, would be under that category. So here's the thing is you can determine what the categories are, and you may come up with 5 or 6 standard categories that you see pretty frequently, but then also be flexible enough to know that sometimes you're going to need to add new categories. And so depending on the particular training that we're evaluating or the particular agency we're working with, we will have certain categories. For example, there are some organizations that part of their training is to build up camaraderie. So camaraderie or networking or, employee involvement or engagement are part of that. So those would be themes that we might add in for those particular agencies if that was part of the purpose of their training. You can see, love the virtual learning environment was one of the comments. In our new COVID world, we're dealing with a lot of organizations that have had to pivot their face-to-face training into an online environment. And they immediately wanted to collect information about how the learning environment is impacting how people learn and whether it's still working for them. And so it's been largely positive overall. I can tell you that across the board, across the 6 or 7 agencies that we support. We have been seeing that there has been a lot of positive response in how agencies have been able to very quickly change the delivery format of training and still have it be successful. with a couple of glitches here and there, because there are some things that if you don't change how you present the content and you move from an in-person to virtual, some things don't translate well to the virtual environment, as you know. So that might become a theme all on its own because it is an important one at the time, or you may want to say something more generically, just like technology or the training environment, and that allows you to group that data together as well. So we just wanted to give you a feel for how we take a look at qualitative data. And if you were doing it manually and didn't have a system to help you do it, this is really the approach that we would recommend, is to come up with those topics and themes and get some speed readers to help you out if you have lots of comments.
So one thing to Denise's point about expanding on or condensing certain categories, this comment here, hands-on learning, out of all of the topics that we created, I imagine that it would fall under attributes of the training. But since this is a pretty broad category, we can drill it down to say something like course format, or even just directly just say hands-on learning and see how many other comments can be categorized within that bucket. So these categories are constantly evolving based on the information that's being received. They're either some get cut out completely, some get absorbed by another category, but it's usually what we start with is seldom what we end up with, because there's so much change after going through all of the data. And then in addition, when it comes to quantifying the qualitative information, one additional thing we do at PTG is we incorporate various calculations related to the different categories that are created. So at the end of a coding, we're able to determine what percentage of comments fall within each category and report on that for our clients.
As well as collecting that sentiment analysis that we showed you earlier. So the categorization into themes along with the sentiment analysis is what really allows us to know what the story is that we want to tell. So let me go back to sharing our slides. Let's see, where is my slides? Okay. And let me get back to our page here. So can you see my screen? Is it on the right slide?
Yes. Okay. So after going through and coding this data set, some general conclusions that can be made are that this was overall a pretty good training. Participants really valued the information. They enjoyed learning from that specific set of instructors. The information was useful, and the course length and virtual environment were both adequate. One thing to point out here is that these are responses that were collected for a question that aimed at collecting information on what respondents liked the most about training. So that's why we usually get a positive response for positively geared questions. But one thing I wanted to point out is that there is no magical set of questions that will give you all of the information that you're looking for. When creating these surveys instruments, we try to tailor the questions to the training program's goals and objectives. And when we receive the data, we code it objectively and give the responses and the statistical numbers back to the training program so that they can review and make adjustments to their program as needed.
So we talked a little bit about how we analyze quantitative and qualitative data, But I also want to mention that the data that you collect or the data that you don't collect but have available to you through other organizations can all be very valuable if you are able to take that data and slice it and look at it in different ways. And so that's one of the things that we wanted to try to get you, put your thinking caps on and say, how can I take this data and look at it in a meaningful way so that I can find those stories? And one of the things that we experienced when we worked for Maryland Transit Authority is they had a program for their customer service. Overall, over the entire organization, they felt like their customer service needed to improve. And predominantly that was because they were receiving complaints on their customer service line, and those complaints were not getting resolved in a timely manner. Some of them were would be unresolved for days, and they were not getting very many commendations. And so they said, we need to do something about customer service and make some improvements. So they put a new customer service training program in place. And when they did that, they said, customer service is everyone's job, not just the job of the individuals that are out dealing with the public, but everyone, even internally in the organization. Because if we all treat each other like customers, then those who are dealing with the public will also be in that positive mindset to also treat the outward public that uses Maryland Transit in a positive way that's going to get us more commendations and less complaints. And we also wanted to make sure that they were improving the responses from the customer service desk, but we wanted to make sure that all of the entire organization knew that it wasn't just the customer service desk's role to pay attention to customer service. So they included all of that in their training program, and they wanted to know if it was having an impact. And what we did was we, of course, collected how people reacted to the training and what they were doing differently on the job. But the real telling story was when we asked for the customer service data so that we could see what was happening to the calls that were coming in, to how they were being handled, how long were they open, were they being closed more timely, and were they going down in number. And what we found was as more and more of the organization went through the customer service training, commendations were increasing, complaints were decreasing, and the time that complaint calls were open was reduced. And so they were able to definitively say that the new customer service training had a positive impact on the customer service at Maryland Transit Authority. And we were able to do that all by looking at the data that we received, both the data that we collected as a training organization, but also the data that was already being collected from the operations side. Some of you may remember at our awards ceremony for TOC last year that we presented the Census Bureau with an award. We were very pleased at PTG to be a part of that success story in that we helped the Census Bureau to analyze the data that they were collecting as they trained 400,000 participants that they had to hire for temporary work to do address canvassing, update leave, and enumeration, which is where you respond to non-response follow-up dwellings of individuals that had not yet completed the census. So in this new COVID world, that became very challenging. They had a blended approach to their training, which really lent itself well to being modified to deal with the new limitations of a lack of in-person instruction. So because they were able to, because they already had online training coupled with in-person instruction, they only had to change the in-person instruction to conference call training. And that proved to be still effective in helping them to train the masses that they needed to train across the country and including in Puerto Rico so that they could go out and collect the information that they needed to make sure that they had a comprehensive data collection effort for the 2020 census. So we were really happy to be a part of that story, and we're able to help them see through this process that we just described to you, where we took their data, we aggregated their quantitative results and gave them the percentage of positive responses. And then for areas where there was more challenging responses from negative or even just neutral, we could look at the qualitative comments, categorize those, and let them know what the top themes were that participants responded to. And that would help them to determine what things went well and what things could go better and what things were out of their control, quite honestly, because one of the things that they realized is that individuals that were using their own technology to access the training, for example, were not as successful as areas where they were using the technology provided by Census that was in a more controlled environment, because the Census Bureau would be sending out certain tools that they could use, and those tools were more effective when they sent them the hardware in addition to the software. And I'll pass it over to Rakaya, who can tell you a little bit about what we're doing at the Transportation Security Administration as she heads up that effort.
Sure. So currently we are involved in assisting the evaluations arm of the TSA in evaluating the data for a big set of their training programs. So after COVID hit, we started to see that in the data that we were collecting, there was a lot of responses regarding the virtual environment versus the traditional in-person environment. And we started to report on that information that we were seeing. So one of the outcomes of that, those reporting efforts were that the TSA is looking into implementing the virtual delivery of their courses as a permanent option for their transportation security officers moving forward. So right now they are, it's still something that's being designed at this point, but it is because of the information that we reported on that they are making these big decisions, moving the training from the traditional in-person setting to a virtual option permanently moving forward. So that's a big example of how conducting a thorough analysis really does drive decision-making in these organizations.
So I just wanted to see if there were any other questions that you have. There is a session survey. If you haven't filled that out yet, please do fill that out. And we hope that we've been able to give you some information that can help you professionally and personally, and that we've met or exceeded your expectations. Does anyone have any challenges or questions for us regarding your data collection and analysis efforts? Thanks, Gary. I still remember your three-legged table, Gary. See, it was a memorable title because I never forgot it. So we hope that we've given you some things to think about and also some things to help you as you design your evaluation. That's right. We talked about themes in your session as well. So, and, you know, Rakai and I love talking about data. We are geeky that way. Yes, I call her a geek. It's okay. She's used to it. So, you know, if you have any questions that you think about later, we would love to chat with you. Come visit us at our exhibit hall. And that's right. Where do you get that rich data? Where can it be found and how to get it? And I can tell you that one of the things that we have found is, you know, reach across over to other parts of the organization and start virtually shaking some hands with folks and ask them how you can help them solve their problems, because that's what we are, right? As a training organization, we really are problem solvers for our agencies. Great question, Eileen. Is there a standard list of typical qualitative categories? And, you know, I think as we mentioned earlier, you will usually find the ones that we've talked about, course content, instructor, environment. Those are usually typical categories, but those really change based on the agency that we're supporting. And so you will have, you know, your, you know, very common ones that are pretty standard across all training organizations or all types of training, but they can get very specific very quickly. And so we really advise you to look at your data and see what comes out, right? It's that difference between inductive and deductive approach. You can make some assumptions about what those topics are probably going to be, but be ready to pivot if you find that the information, the data you've collected is telling you something else.
Denise, I do want to be conscious of time because your session is about to end. So I want to thank you and Rakaya for a very informative session. I want to remind everybody, you can still connect with both of these presenters in their session chat, as well as Denise just said, visit their booth in the exhibit hall. Thank you both so much, and remind everybody that within a week, we're going to have all the recordings of our live sessions available for you to watch over the next year. Thanks,
Wonderful.
everyone.
Hey, just remember, ignite change. That's one of our game codes. So there's another code for you.
Awesome.
Have a great day, everyone. And the slides and the sample spreadsheet are also downloadable from this page. Come and check out our exhibit booth, and we have our capability statement there if you want to download that. Great to see
Thank you so
everyone.
much, everyone.